Everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the relaunch of the Diaspora Voices conversation series put on by the Office of Global Partnerships at the U.S. Department of State and the International Organization for Migration. We're so excited to have you all here today. And I think it looks like we've got a critical mass forming. Before we begin, there is a poll that should show up just asking if today's time works for you. This is going to be the first of 3 events that we're planning to host this summer, and we want to make sure we can get as many of you involved as possible. So take a moment to respond to that poll, and then we'll get started here in just a moment. All righty. Well, with that, welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us here at the relaunch of Diaspora Voices. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce the new Special Representative for Global Partnerships at the U.S. Department of State, our new colleague, Special Representative Dorothy Mcauliffe, who's going to welcome us with some remarks. Special Representative, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. What a pleasure to be here today. And good evening, everyone. My name is Dorothy Mcauliffe, and I'm the new Special Rep for Global Partnerships at the United States Department of State. And I am truly thrilled to be joining you all at this event. It's my very first in my new role, so it's very special to be here today. The Office of Global Partnerships, or GP, as we're known around the building, is the U.S. government leader in private sector engagement. When I say private sector, I'm referring to any entity that is outside of the federal government. Launched in 2008, we help build and facilitate government partnerships that harness the technology, that harness the technology, markets, and resources of universities, private companies, startups, foundations, faith-based groups, and other organizations within civil society sector. And since its inception in 2008, the Office of Global Partnerships has utilized public-private partnerships to fuel our ability to collaborate with over 1,600 partners and mobilize more than $3.7 billion in public and private sector resource commitments that have enhanced the department's diplomacy and development outcomes. I'm truly thrilled to step into this role, not only because I get to work with brilliant and passionate civil servants and foreign service officers around the world, but I get to collaborate with all of the incredible talent that exists outside of our agency. We work across sectors to advance our foreign policy goals by not only providing partnership tools and resources for the rest of the department, but by also serving as a catalyst and resource for the private sector to work more efficiently and collaboratively with the department in order to achieve our shared goals. Partnerships are not just a kumbaya, feel-good sort of thing. They're a necessary tool in diplomacy and development. If we're not utilizing the talent, skill, and innovation that exists all around the world, we're limiting ourselves, full stop. The whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. Though the U.S. government continues to increase the support it provides to countries around the world, it is outpaced by the increasing flow of resources invested by private and civil sector. According to the 2020 Global Philanthropy Tracker, published by Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, private resources contributed $658 billion across national borders in 2018. That's nearly 4 times the amount of official development assistance. A huge portion of that total comes from the remittances by diaspora communities here in the United States to their countries of origin. Our office realized this important fact years ago. So in 2011, we worked with our counterparts at USAID and our partners at the International Organization for Migration to launch an innovative partnership called IDEA, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance. IDEA harnessed the global connections of diaspora communities to promote sustainable development in their countries of heritage. By supporting partnerships around entrepreneurship, volunteerism, philanthropy, and innovation, the Alliance provided a platform for capacity building and a forum for collaboration across sectors to expand efforts and to improve lives in countries of origin. I bring this up not to rest on our laurels, but to establish a history. We're relaunching the Diaspora Voices series today because we know that working with diaspora communities and organizations works. The Biden-Harris administration agrees and have emphasized through our foreign policy for the middle class goals that we need to engage underrepresented voices in the work of diplomacy and development. We know that we don't have a monopoly on addressing the big issues, and I can't think of a bigger issue than the climate crisis. We know that meaningful, impactful solutions are out there, and we know that it's going to need to incorporate as many perspectives as possible if we're going to tackle these issues in a big way. I'm truly looking forward to the Diaspora Voices series, which will focus on the climate crisis in advance of COP27, so we can learn from our diaspora communities like yours about how we can best combat the climate crisis together. If you would like to learn more about how your organization can work with the U.S. Department of State, please email my office at partnerships@state.gov or visit our website at www.state.gov/s/partnerships. You can also keep in touch with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook using the handle @GPATState. And with that, I want to thank our wonderful partners at the International Organization of Migration and officially welcome you to Diaspora Voices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Special Representative Mcauliffe. It's now my pleasure to turn over the camera, so to speak, to our colleagues from IOM. So Daphne, would you mind sharing your screen and loading up these remarks? These remarks will come from Manuel Pereira, the head of Division for Migration, Environments, and Climate Change at IOM.
IOM is delighted to partner with the U.S. Department of State Offices of Global Partnerships on the Diaspora Voices program to fight climate change. The important role of diaspora in giving back to their communities, but helping also to mitigate these risks and vulnerabilities through a number of solutions like remittances, DRR, preparedness, prevention, or advocacy, but also innovations, finding new solutions for water desalination and conservation. IOM strongly believes that migrants, diasporas, sending and receiving communities are essential actors who can help address current and future sustainable development challenges and calls for a whole-of-society approach. IOM will seek to develop solutions that leverage the potential of migration for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, but also to enhance the contributions of migrants, diasporas, and communities to climate action and resilience building. It's very important to open the doors so civil society, including diasporas, share their voices, their concerns, and their worries. We need to be together to be able to fight the climate crisis the world will face over the coming years. IOM is very committed to being one of the vehicles to allow these voices to be heard.
Thank you so much, IOM. Really appreciate it. And now for the exciting part. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Michaela Machiavello, a senior regional specialist on labor mobility and social inclusion at IOM. Michaela, we'll let you introduce the panelists, but please take us away.
Thank you very much, Brian. It is for me a real pleasure to be able to be here at this event, the first one of its series, and it is for me a real honor to be able to moderate also this panel that brings together very interesting speakers with very different background and stories. And it is for this reason that I am sure we are quite much looking forward to hearing their ideas as suggestions. Now, I have with me three speakers that I would prefer to give the space and 1 minute each to introduce themselves, because generally moderators don't give justice to their speakers. So please go ahead. I think that we can start with Sophia and then Angelo and Andrea. You have 1 minute each to introduce yourselves to the audience. Please go ahead.
Awesome. I'll start. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Keaney, and I am a 20-year-old Iranian-American climate activist. I'm currently a sophomore at Stanford studying science, technology, and society with a concentration in climate policy. I'm the founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals, which is an international youth-led nonprofit working to make climate education more accessible to people, specifically those who don't speak English. And I also represent the US as the youngest member of the United Nations Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change.
Thanks very much, Sophia. We can go on with Angelo, please.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning for some of you. My name is Angelo Vila. I was born in a village on a small island next to the Mariana Trench. I'm from the Northern Mariana Islands, which is one of the territories of the United States. I have lived in Washington, D.C. For about the last 12 years. I am a professional ocean advocate. I am an Indigenous Chamorro man, and I am a mediocre ukulele player and singer. In my work, what I do is I'm also a scientist. So I use Western science and Indigenous values to solve some of the issues and the threats that are facing our ocean today. So I work for an organization called the Center for American Progress here in Washington, D.C. My official title is I'm the Senior Fellow for Indigenous-led Conservation, and I work with tribes and Indigenous groups in the United States and in the territories.
Thanks very much, Angelo. And Andrea, please go ahead. You have the floor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Wilson. I'm originally from Jamaica, so I bring a Caribbean voice to this table. And I think it's timely since we are currently celebrating Caribbean American History this month. I'm a former diplomat for Jamaica, having served more than 27 years in the Jamaican Foreign Service, and my last posting before I left the government service was at the United Nations. Of course, since Jamaica is a small country with limited resources and limited capacity, I am something of a generalist. I have a broad range of experiences and subject matter expertise that I also bring to the table. I currently work at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'm an officer on the High Seas team. And our focus is to protect the high seas using a number of tools, but most notably to encourage the establishment of marine protected areas in the global commons. I'm not a scientist or a marine biologist, but I care deeply about the oceans. It's Ocean Week on Capitol Hill. It's World Oceans Day today. So I believe this conversation is well timed, and I'm only too happy to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very clear introduction and very hopeful, very interesting and stimulating introduction from our three speakers. So just for the audience to know that this panel is going to be running for about half an hour. We have a series of questions for which I will give a certain amount of minutes to our speakers. And I encourage the audience to please enter any questions or need for clarification in the chat. I will not be able to see the chat, but I know that I have colleagues here who are very kindly going to support me for this. So please do not hesitate to interrupt in case something is not clear and anyone from the audience would like clarifications. But I also want to stress that there is going to be a little space for questions at the end of the panel, and that this panel will also be followed by another extra time where our speakers will be able to either answer questions from the audience or receive other questions that we have prepared for them. So here we go. I think that we could start. The first question is a question for all, for which, that's to say, the same for all speakers, for which I'm going to give you 2 minutes each. And the question is the following. Could you please describe to us how you got involved in ocean-related efforts and what your role could be in contributing to ocean-based environmental and sustainable solutions? Thank you very much. So I pass the word to Sophia, please. 2 minutes.
I think for me, getting involved in ocean conservation and advocacy efforts was more so just a larger extension of my interest in climate activism. And the way that I originally got involved and interested in climate activism was growing up. I grew up visiting Iran, which is my parents' home country, and I was struck by how horrible the air pollution was and the fact that the Middle East was being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. And more largely, there's a lot of issues around water mismanagement in the issue, droughts, flooding. And so I think that a combination of these factors made me really interested in climate change, and then made me also start to consider issues of like water mismanagement and ocean conservation. And I learned when like the fifth IPCC report came out in like 2013, they said that like 93% of like extra energy from the enhanced greenhouse gas effect is absorbed by the ocean. And so I became very aware of the fact that the ocean plays such a large role in furthering our like climate action ambitions, and it's such a powerful tool for us. And so I think that it more largely has become a central focus of my advocacy, just in terms of like, for example, my nonprofit Climate Cardinals translates resources around climate crisis information and like advocacy information. And a lot of the resources that we have translated cover the importance of like ocean conservation in the grand scheme of advancing climate action.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So for you, it's really connected to the way you grew up and that you started to notice how already desperate the situation is, especially when you stress that the 93% of the current pollution is indeed absorbed by the ocean. This is certainly quite a disconcerting fact. Let's now go on to Angelo. Angelo, would you like me to repeat the question, or are you okay?
How I got interested in ocean.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm from an island. It's surrounded by the ocean. And funny enough, I went to college and I never actually took a single marine biology course. I grew up in the 1980s. In the 1980s, it was all about save the rainforest. So like I thought I was going to end up in Costa Rica, replanting rainforests. But I got really interested in grassroots activism and also American politics. And when I went home to Saipan after college, and I was looking for that first job, it turned out that I was, like I just mentioned, I was surrounded by this giant ocean. So the first job I got out of college, I was working on coral reef conservation out in Saipan, and sort of one thing led to the next. I got hooked up with a large NGO, and I had a great 14-year career with them. Some of the stuff I've done, the organization I worked for 14 years is called the Pew Charitable Trusts. And we sponsored the resolution in 2016 that calls for 30% of the ocean to be protected. And I led that project with 2 other women at Pew. I also recently helped define industrial fishing at the IUCN, which my mom is very, very excited about. But these days, I'm doing less of the international policy work and working with communities. So back at home in Saipan, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we get to some of the other questions. But I work with folks back home on some of the ocean issues that they're working on.
Thanks very much, Angelo. So for you too, very much connected to the place where you were born and where you then ended up, going back after your studies and working on coral conservation, which started you off. And especially, I would like to stress the big achievement of coming out with the 2013 resolution while you were working at the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you very much. And then we continue with Andrea. Andrea, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Like Angelo, I was born on an island surrounded by water. And as you can imagine, most people in the islands gravitate towards the sea. And I've always loved the ocean. But beyond that, my first substantive interaction on ocean issues in a formal sense at the policy level came about when I was posted to work for the Embassy of Jamaica in London. And I was accredited to the International Maritime Organization as a representative of Jamaica. And this gave me the opportunity to champion issues pertaining to that vast resource called the oceans, which many people refer to as the common heritage of mankind. At least this is one way in which it is reflected in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I had the privilege of championing issues relating not just to shipping, but also to marine environment protection. I also had the privilege of participating in a number of bilateral maritime delimitation negotiations Jamaica had with other countries. And at one time, I attended some meetings of the International Seabed Authority. Well, more recently, while I served as a diplomat at the United Nations, I contributed to Jamaica's positions on the annual omnibus resolution, they call it, on oceans and law of the sea. And today, I work as an officer at the Pew Charitable Trusts on our High Seas team, as I mentioned earlier, working on a campaign to ensure that there is a robust implementation agreement under UNCLOS for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdictions. That's a mouthful, so we call it the BBNJ agreement. But basically, it's an agreement to protect the high seas. And my current role really speaks to your question about the contribution to ocean-based environment and sustainable solutions, because it's in the field of advocacy. This is an attempt to close a gap in international law to protect the high seas, a governance gap, if you will, an institutional gap, and a protection gap. By the way, I say there's a governance gap, an institutional gap, and so on, because currently the world community is operating in silos. So for example, we have IMO working only on shipping. We have the Seabed Authority regulating seabed mining, FAO working on fisheries, UNEP working on the environmental issues, but there's no overarching governance structure. And so that's what we're working on. My work at Pew is focused on ensuring that the global community seeks to protect the oceans, which cover almost 2/3 of our planet's surface, so that future generations can benefit from its resources. So whether we're talking about anthropogenic effects on the high seas or the negative impacts of climate change, whether we're talking about pollution, depleting fish stocks, or the impacts on other marine life in the water column or on the ocean floor, it is hoped that this BBNJ agreement will close some of those gaps. And in an attempt to find sustainable solutions for the high seas, we are advocating for parties to the agreement when it is finalized to be able to identify, establish, and designate a network of marine protected areas so that marine life can have an opportunity to spawn and reproduce and replenish themselves. Apologies for that. So the natural habitats and ecosystems can also regenerate themselves. And finally, we're advocating for robust provisions in that agreement for environmental impact assessments to be conducted when activities on the high seas are likely to have more than a minor or transitory impact on the ocean. And we're hoping the negotiations on the agreement will conclude later this year. And finally, in the context of my engagement on these issues, I work closely with and focus on support for countries of the Caribbean and Africa, among others. So I do manage to give back to my country of origin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. For you too, then it started with your home country, Jamaica, but it really started when you were in London. And now I think it became a global matter by actually focusing on the BBNJ agreement and really trying to make it work globally. All right, thanks very much. I suppose that then we can start with a series of questions that will be directed to each one of you. And I am going to start with Sophia. Sophia, here we go. The question is the following. Could you tell us what is the diaspora role in elevating or creating the space for local voices and communities in their country of origin when it comes to climate change action and especially ocean conservation? You have the floor. You have 4 minutes. Thank you.
I think that a common theme that I've seen among my work is that climate activists believe it's incredibly important that those who are being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, like the frontline communities, need to really have their voices heard when it comes to climate decision making. Often I so often hear that the people who are making decisions tend to be rich, old, white, privileged men who have no idea how these communities are suffering on the front lines of the climate crisis. And so to have the voices of these local communities included in decision making really makes it so that the solutions that we're coming up with are abundantly more progressive and also take into account a more intersectional approach. And so I think that a lot of the work that I do as part of like the UN's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change has been looking for ways to incorporate the voices specifically of youth, but from different communities all over the US into channeling the messages that we then relay to the UN Secretary General. And so just most recently, 2 weeks ago, we held this US consultation where we had young people, I believe, from over 40 states participate. And we got them together and they all shared their experiences with how climate change was impacting their communities. And they shared different recommendations and guidelines that they had for policymakers and decision makers in their region regarding what they thought were pressing concerns. And I think that continuing to hold consultations and continuing to engage in processes like that is incredibly valuable, because then you avoid creating echo chambers where only specific select portion of the population has their voices heard. And I think that also another point that I think is incredibly important and worth mentioning is that when you're elevating and creating space for local voices and communities, you're also taking into account factors such as Indigenous knowledge. And so incorporating the voices of Indigenous people who protect the majority of the world's biodiversity and have been really climate advocates far longer than most of the population, I think has so much value and so much merit. And I think that the combination of all those factors of bringing in these different voices from civil society really makes it so that we have a more inclusive process that takes into account factors such as the fact that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts women. 80% of climate refugees are women, children, young people like me who are incredibly worried that we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change at a rate 3 times higher than our grandparents. And then also like taking into account factors such as environmental racism, so including the voices of people of color who understand how these crises are really disproportionately impacting negatively their communities.
Thanks very much, Sophia. I wanted to stress again the very important point that you made, that frontline communities, including youth, including Indigenous communities, need to be included, their voice heard. They are the frontliners, as you call them, and very often they are not. And I think that this speaks very much to the intervention that Angelo is going to make at this moment. It seems logical, yes, but in fact, it never happens. And so we are going to pass to Angelo with his question, which is the following. You have often spoken and also written about the need to decolonize conservation. I would like you to tell us a bit more about this and also how you think that members of the diaspora can contribute to these efforts. Thanks very much. You have the floor.
Yeah, I want to thank Sophia for calling attention to Indigenous people, because we are the stewards of nature across the planet. So I've written about decolonization, like you said, for many years. It's a term that you see Pacific Islanders use a lot. And we could actually have an entire conference just discussing decolonization, and I've got about 3 minutes. So the first thing, if you want to talk about decolonization, the first thing that you have to do is you have to accept that colonization exists today, and it exists in a number of different countries. Now, it's going to be context specific, and it's going to look different in different countries and different places. Even here in the United States, decolonization is going to look different for the tribes that are on the East Coast of the United States. It's going to look different for the Native Hawaiians who live in a state, and it's going to be different for the Chamorros and the Samoans who live in the territories. Now, I'll tell you right up front, in the Mariana Islands, decolonization means demilitarization. Our people think that the greatest threat to our ocean is the military. And there are studies that show the US military is one of the largest emitters of carbon pollution on the planet. They emit more carbon than something like 70 countries combined. So it's really incredible. Now, understanding my context a little bit more, I'm from the Northern Mariana Islands, and you may or may not have heard of the Insular Acts, but these are the Supreme Court decisions that tell our country how to deal with the territories. And these acts, which have been called racist, say that our islands are owned by, but not part of the United States. So the full Constitution does not automatically apply to us. Like we don't get to vote for president. We don't have voting representation in the United States Congress. And like those are like, core things for Americans. Representation, having representation in your government is incredibly important, but the territories don't have that. These same acts, the reason they say that is because we're brown. They call us savage and restless. Like this is actually US law, and that because we're savage and restless, we're unable to understand Anglo-Saxon ideals. I guarantee you that's wrong. But colonialism has resulted in the United States that we have today. And the United States is an ocean country. There are over 11 million square kilometers of ocean that belong to the United States. And guess what? 79% of all US waters are in Hawaii, Alaska, and the territories. 29% are just the Pacific territories. And the Biden administration has been excellent. I'm going to bring it back to ocean stuff now. The Biden administration has been very, very good on conservation and on climate change. And we have the America the Beautiful initiative, which is, it seeks to address the three threats facing nature today: the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and then the justice crisis. And I applaud the Biden administration. But on the ocean, if you were to do an analysis of where the highly protected marine areas are in the United States, 99.7% are in the waters of Hawaiians, Chamorros, Samoans, and other Micronesians. So, the Pacific Islanders are carrying the entire conservation burden for the United States. 99.7% of those highly protected areas are in our waters. So how do we bring that back to the diaspora? Well, I'm here working in Washington, D.C. I need to help my people back home get the resources that they need to manage those resources, to deal with climate change. And it's really hard to do because we don't help elect the president, we don't get to vote for that, and we don't have voting representation in Congress. So it's very complicated for us. It's very difficult. And I'll sort of stop there. That's sort of like the primer on decolonization in the Northern Mariana Islands.
Thanks very much, Angelo. I think that you just touched on the tip of the iceberg, really. I mean, this is an enormous topic, but I wanted to just remind the audience that if you just Google decolonization and Angelo Villa-Gomez, quite a lot comes up. So I really strongly encourage you to go for that. I agree with you that the savage and restless conception is slightly, interestingly wrong, and it needs to be changed as a priority. And I want to stress what you underlined during these 2 minutes, that 99.7% of the burden, of the water of Micronesia, actually, of all the waters that carry the conservation burden are in Micronesia, and that for this reason, then the inhabitants of this area need to be given the voice, need to be given the chance to actually say what they think is best for the areas where they live. Thanks very much, Angelo, and we move then to Andrea with the following question. Andrea, could you tell us how can diaspora help us to advocate for ocean sustainability at the global level in countries of destination and in countries of origin? Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you for that very interesting question. I'm going to speak about my own personal experience first, and then I'm going to speak more broadly because first of all, I'm really privileged to be able to advocate for ocean sustainability at the global level currently. In the course of my work on the BBNJ agreement, I get a chance to work with diplomats from all over the world at the UN on, and ocean sustainability is precisely what we're striving to achieve. We want to protect the ocean. We want to protect the high seas, which belongs to all of us, which belongs to no one. My work at the Pew Charitable Trusts allows me to engage with governments on marine protected areas, for example, which is regarded as the gold standard for protecting the oceans. We organize and execute workshops. For example, we bring skilled technical personnel to the region, to the Caribbean, to Africa and other regions to share their knowledge and expertise on ocean conservation and sustainability with national governments. And like I said, we do this in the Caribbean, we do this in Africa, in the Pacific, and other regions around the world. This expert advice and scientific information that's delivered has proven to be invaluable to small countries, especially those in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And one thing is clear, and that is that the importance of engaging all stakeholders is stark. This means engaging governments and private citizens. Stakeholders from fisheries and aquaculture, mining, foreign affairs, legal, maritime administrations, environment departments, among others. And on the private sector side, academics, philanthropists, local fishing communities, and so on, because all voices need to be taken on board in addressing ocean protection. And beyond that, speaking more generally, I believe that people in the diaspora like myself have a lot to bring to the table. There's an ongoing discussion, which was mentioned by an earlier speaker, about how much we contribute to our countries of origin through remittances. And in the case of Jamaica, the central bank reported recently that in 2020, remittances from the diaspora amounted to roughly $3 billion. Of course, remittances can be helpful in times of disasters, for example, during the COVID pandemic and even during the annual hurricane season that we experience in the Caribbean region, when countries tend to suffer a lot of devastation after being hit by these hurricanes. Separate and apart from that, though, I think members of the diaspora have an opportunity to advocate for ocean sustainability at the global level in many other ways. We can share knowledge, lessons learned, best practices, and provide evidence-based information and technical expertise, to our countries of origin to try and improve systemic problems. And in my case, I happen to work for an organization that believes in following scientific rigor and doing thorough research. Some scientists project that by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish, and this is not sustainable. Other scientists also tell us that we must protect at least 30% of the ocean by 2030 if we want to continue to benefit from the resources in the ocean. So as people in the diaspora, some of us are well placed to encourage governments back home to take concerted action, to rise to the clarion call to remove things like single-use plastics from our economies, for example. And there are a couple of Caribbean countries doing that already. We can encourage governments back home to ensure that they're on the right side of history and increase marine protections so that we can sustainably use the oceans, not just within our coastal waters, but in areas beyond national jurisdiction, since marine resources are transboundary in nature. They're not static. So what happens in our coastal waters has an impact on what happens in waters adjacent to our EEZs, ultimately impacting the high seas. In other words, we in the diaspora can participate in agenda setting. And in the case of Jamaica, we have a formal framework within which voices of the diaspora is heard. There is a frequent diaspora conference between governments and private individuals like myself can seek to influence what is on that agenda. By including issues relating to ocean sustainability, for example, and pressing government to take action on protecting the ocean. We can contribute time, skill, or talents, the overseas experiences that we have. We can provide research if we are capable. We can partner with local NGOs in our countries of origin on identifying sustainable solutions. We can reach out to elected officials in our former neighborhoods back home and encourage local communities to do the same. On the flip side, as current residents in countries like the US, we can raise awareness about developments at home that require concerted action and draw attention to these issues. Whether we're talking about helping to secure grants or aid or other types of support, we can also reach out to elected officials here in the US about collaborative action they can take with our countries since we have common concerns. Many senators, congressmen are of Caribbean origin. Many are from the diaspora themselves. And so this is something that we can also do. We can serve as watchdogs to ensure implementation of sound decisions and strategies are taken by governments at home. So these are just some of the ways in which I think that people in the diaspora can contribute. And I would encourage public-private partnerships and participation in diaspora events. In fact, I would encourage other Caribbean countries, if they have not yet done so, to take similar action as we do in Jamaica, to harness the voices of their countrymen and hold regular engagements with people from the diaspora who can bring expertise, knowledge, and so on to support their country of origin. So I think we bring a lot to the table. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea, for stressing how much diaspora can contribute to making a change now. And especially thanks also for the large number of ideas, examples that you have given us and the public on how this change can be implemented without further delay. Now, I am being told that we are already over time. And so I wonder how we managed, but I think that it was so interesting that we might have just gotten carried away. So I wanted to give Sophia the possibility to take the next question. And then we have a question from the audience that I wanted to pose to Angelo and Andrea, if you don't mind. I think that you might still have the chance to answer your question too in the next session, if time allows. Yeah. So I will ask now Sophia to keep her answer short to 1.5 minutes on the next question. So could you tell me, Sophia, what are some of the positive outcomes for younger people like you who have engaged in global climate action and advocacy, please? 1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll keep it short, but I think that given that my generation is going to be disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, I do feel like we have a extremely certain sense of urgency, where for us, this is a matter of the fact that we know that as the climate crisis continues to get worse, our living conditions, the way that our communities are living, the way that communities around the world are living, are going to continue to become fundamentally unlivable. And so because of that, I think that the creation of institutions such as the UN's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change allow us to have a concrete seat at the table to be able to provide meaningful inputs about the way that we feel about the climate crisis, what we feel about climate legislation, and just more generally, I think that part of the biggest role that we as young people can play is putting pressure on elected officials to understand just how pressing and how important we feel about this issue, so that they hopefully feel compelled to take action, similar to how with in the civil rights era and the women's suffrage movement, the way that people took to the streets and took action and organized large strikes. I think that the way that young people have been doing that with movements like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion have been really effective in terms of really pushing forward and raising public enthusiasm for climate action.
Fantastic, Sophia. Thanks very much for stressing how important it is, the fact of putting pressure on elected officers and the fact that this really brings to successful outcomes. Righto, then we have a question from the public. Our colleague is called Mike Roman. Thank you very much for your question. And so I will leave the question to answer to Angela and Andrea, one after the other. You have 1.5 minutes. And the question is, how do you all keep a positive outlook while experiencing constant devastating frontline impacts at home? Angela, do you want to try to give it a stab?
Who said I had a positive outlook? We have a joke in our office that at any given time, 20% of the people in our field want to quit their jobs because they're so stressed out and tired. But we don't. We stick with it. For me, I know I have some listeners from home on this call right now. Lori, hello. Jolene, thank you for waking up early to listen to me talk. So for me, the thing that gets me to wake up in the morning and continue doing what I do is them. Thinking about my friends, my family, my loved ones. We share a very good friend and leader back home. Her name is Representative Sheila Babauta. She's one of the youngest Indigenous women ever elected to office, and she is a Obama Asia Pacific Fellow. And a couple of years ago, she went to the meeting. I think it was in Jakarta, and President Obama was allowing the audience to answer questions. She raised her hand. President Obama pointed at her, and she asked a question similar to what I brought up earlier with the military. We're very concerned about military destruction of our islands. And President Obama looked her in the eyes and said, Sheila, I need you to go home. I need you to raise awareness. I need you to gather allies, and I need you to unify your voice. And, thinking of those words, they're President Obama's words, but they're also Sheila's words, and they're my words now too.
Thanks very much, Angela, for this very powerful image of what happened. And indeed, what keeps you going is the hope to be able to still do something before it's too late, yeah? And Andrea, please, the same question to you. Would you like me to repeat the question, or are you okay?
Yes.
Right, here we go. How do you all keep a positive or non-positive, as Angela was saying, outlook while experiencing constant devastating frontline impacts at home? You have the floor.
Thank you very much for a very interesting question. It is true that we have challenges at home. It is true that we have capacity constraints. There are limited access to scientific information, materials, technology, and data. Some of our countries in the region have weak or non-existent policy and regulatory or legislative frameworks. And maybe we have nascent biotech sectors, or we lack sophisticated high-tech equipment, things like that. On the natural front, we do face hurricanes year after year. We are facing sea level rise and so on, but it's not all doom and gloom. There is hope. The ocean is the lifeblood of Caribbean countries. And I think with that knowledge in mind, governments have taken more interest in the blue economy as a solution for development. I'm sorry, there's a rip in my internet connection. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was saying that it's not all doom and gloom. We are a happy people. We still manage to enjoy the ocean. We still manage to participate in the
So Andrea, I think we lost your feed.
Thanks very much. I'm actually here. There is a very high storm going on here. I don't know whether it's my central connection that is going badly or whether we lost Andrea. Brian, Can you hear us?
I think we lost the end of Andrea's remarks, but I think that the message came through loud and clear. And Michaela, if you want to close out this panel before the storm takes you away.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I think I should do it before my connection also goes, because of the storm is really raging here. I wanted to thank all panelists for these very inspiring words. Our audience to go and look up the panelists and read their writings, read their articles, because they're indeed very powerful. And inspiring. Word back to Brian. Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we caught those final words before the internet drops. But Michaela, thank you so much for that fantastic moderation. But most importantly, Angelo, Sophia, and Andrea, thank you so much for both your insight, your honesty, and your candor in your remarks. I think we all have a lot to go back in our own work based on the words you provided. Andrea, near the end of her remarks, mentioned data and tech. I could not imagine a better segue to a brief presentation we're going to have from one of our new friends at Amazon Web Services Open Data team. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Chris Stoner, the Open Environmental Data Lead at Amazon Web Services. Daphne, I believe, will be posting your presentation with a shared screen. But Chris, welcome you to unmute yourself and take it away.
Hi there. Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me? Awesome. Thank you so much for giving me just a couple of minutes. I'll be brief. I do have a couple of slides, but I will try not to bore everyone with all of the slides. After hearing the three panelists and their very powerful message, I wanted to talk a little bit about solutioning. So at Amazon Web Services, we have a couple of programs that might help. For a couple of different use cases that I'll talk about specifically. So my name is Chris Stoner. I'm the Open Environmental Data Lead at AWS on the Open Data Program. So I'll talk about the Open Data Program as well as Amazon's Sustainability Data Initiative. Next slide, please. So what is the Open Data Program? So I'll start by the Open Data Program and how does it work? Next slide. So why does AWS care about open data and what is open data? So for open data, we provide data free and open to the public for anyone to use for any purpose. This data could be from NASA or Noaa or some other public entity. Typically on the supply side, we have government agencies that sometimes have a mandate to provide open data, data to the general public. And then on the demand side, typically it's a commercial customer who wants to create a derived product or a research scientist who wants to solve a climate or environmental issue. Next slide. So for AWS, we think that it's faster if you move your data and you move your compute to the cloud. So in a traditional approach, if you have a bunch of data, you have to download it. And if you're a researcher, you have to wait until all of that data is downloaded before you can begin your research. I worked at the Alaska Satellite Facility, and we literally had customers that would mail hard drives to us and ask us to put the data on a hard drive and mail it back to them before they could begin their research. Next slide. If you flip this approach and actually just bring the data to bring the compute to the cloud where the data is. If you put the data into storage, into Amazon S3, it can be provided in the scalable storage in a single place where researchers and commercial customers can use the data in the cloud without having to wait to download the data first. And you have all these services that are available in the cloud that will allow you to use the data in situ in place. So from the Open Data Sponsorship Program, we cover the storage costs for the data in S3 as well as egress. And if you don't know what egress is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's free to put data into AWS, but there's a charge for objects as they are downloaded. There's no charge to use them in the cloud, but there is a charge to download files, and we cover that cost as well. So the idea is to really democratize access to data for research. Next slide. So if the Open Data Program is the storage side, the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, it's a sort of a sister team to us. You could consider that the compute side. Next slide. So ASDI, or the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, really provides access to compute credits or grants to develop proof of concept development and processing campaigns. Typically, a customer will run a campaign to cloud optimize a data set and then store it into the Open Data Sponsorship Program. So ASDI can cover the compute, and the Open Data Sponsorship Program can cover the storage. That's not always the case, but it is a common pattern. Next slide. Let's skip that one and go ahead. So how can Open Data help you? So here's a good example. Alaska is warming twice as fast as the rest of the US. And this is a village in Alaska that had to move inland after losing some homes and property to coastal erosion. And that can be devastating to a subsistence family or community. Who live off the land as they have for generations. They have to move away from fishing waters that they rely on, and losing property can be very difficult for them to replace. So it took years to get grants from the government to help them move and complete the move to a higher ground. But with access to some open data, they would be able to, other communities in the area will be able to better plan for this type of sea level rise event. Next slide. So with the Open Data Program, if you have access to data like the Noaa climate stations, these are buoys in the ocean that will tell you everything from, salinity, how much salt is in the ocean, sea temperature, as well as sea level rise. Communities can better prepare and understand the long-term impacts of climate change. So for example, there are studies that were done. What will our coastline look like in 10 years? How far inland do we need to move? Do we need to move at all? And it may not be a move situation. It might be a loss of fisheries due to rising sea temperatures and salinity changes. And it's not just Alaska. There's even a situation now in the news. The lobsters in Maine are moving further north into Nova Scotia, but the Maryland blue crabs are moving up into Maine. So it's a change in the fisheries that I think the folks in Maine don't really like, but as is climate change. Next slide. So open data, can really be used for a variety of other use cases: remote forest fires, deforestation, clear cutting of forests, oil spill detection of ships at sea, even illegal fishing. You can see all of this from space. Here's an example using Sentinel-1, which is synthetic aperture radar constellation from ESA. We stored their data in AWS. And it images the planet every day. So you can see change detection from this remote forest fire, for example, without having to actually go out to that site. Next slide. So this is just a set of links. I think we will be sharing the links in the chat. The first one is the Registry of Open Data. If you want to use the data, that's a great way to access it. If you want to apply for compute credits, that's the ASDI link. And the last one is an example of a SageMaker Studio Lab notebook, which is a free set of compute to run basically a Jupyter notebook that you can run some examples using Noaa NextRad data. And if you have any other questions that we haven't covered here, you can always contact me. There's my contact information at the end. I said it would be brief, and I'm done. Back to you, Brian.
Not just brief, but record timing. I don't know how you pack that much in such a short presentation, but thank you so much, Chris. As you've already heard us say before, we are over on time, so we're going to keep the show rolling. But as Chris noted, if you have additional questions for how your community or organization can best utilize this open data, please go ahead and email them. But also, once we open this up to a more general chat at the end, if we've got additional questions and Chris is still on the line, I'm sure they'd be happy to take one or two. But without further ado, we've already heard so much today from so many incredible folks, and we've got one more to introduce. The special Deputy Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Sue Binyas, is going to kind of wrap things up with some remarks now. Sue?
Well, thanks a lot and happy World Ocean Day. So I thought I'd just say maybe 3 things about the work that we're doing on the climate-ocean nexus. The first will be on the role of ocean-based climate solutions in our international climate policy. The second will be on the Our Ocean Conference, which we just co-hosted with Palau, speaking of Pacific Islands. And the third is on kind of what we're doing between now and the next COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, on the topic of shipping decarbonization. So on point 1, which is ocean-based climate solutions, my boss, Secretary Kerry, is, couldn't be more passionate about both climate and oceans, and definitely the nexus between them. So sort of from day one last year, we've been trying to focus not just on regular old international climate policy, but on the role that the ocean might play in providing climate solutions. There's a great paper I can refer you to, which was developed by the high-level panel on the ocean, basically talks about how climate-based solutions can provide up to 1/5 of the emission reductions that are needed to keep a 1.5 degree limit within reach. So it's definitely worth looking into this, into the ocean as a source of solutions. So we've been working for the last year and change on various aspects of ocean-based solutions, whether it's offshore renewable energy, decarbonization of the shipping sector, nature-based solutions in the marine environment, et cetera. At COP26 in Glasgow, we sort of took a 2-track approach. We tried to make sure that the ocean was better integrated, and somebody mentioned silos before. One thing we're trying to do is break down the silos and bring the oceans better integrated into the international climate regime. Now, it sounds like a small thing, but what we started doing was having these ocean climate dialogues where we would both, look at the climate regime, making sure it is taking account of ocean issues, and also invite ocean fora from the rest of the world to come and speak to us about how they're taking into account climate equities in order to have kind of a 2-way street. And the next Ocean Climate Dialogue is taking place next week in Bonn, so we're looking forward to that. So at COP26, the other thing we did is try to look outside the regime and what can we do to promote the climate ocean nexus. And we were part of the launching of several initiatives. One of them was a coalition of countries that are supporting zero emission shipping by 2050, including at the IMO, which Andrea mentioned. Another was the so-called Clydebank Declaration, which is dedicated to promoting green shipping corridors between destinations, between ports. So that's one. 2 is the Our Ocean Conference. Secretary Kerry started those in 2014 or so. So this was the 7th one. I think we missed one or so because of COVID. And we co-hosted it with Palau. It was the first time we had one in a small island developing state. And what makes these conferences, I think, unique is that you don't have a negotiated outcome. You don't have, even though I am one, I would say that there are advantages to not involving negotiators. You're not sitting there dealing with words and text. You actually had a microphone in the front of the room where various actors, whether countries or NGOs, whatever, would just get up and say, here's my commitment. So it was fantastic. And this year, the conference catalyzed over 400 commitments worth more than $16 billion. Now, some of them were related to ocean issues that are not linked to climate, whether that was sort of IUU fishing or things like that. But one of the themes of the conference was, in fact, this ocean-based solutions that can help us keep 1.5 alive. And one of the things we focused on was shipping decarbonization, green corridors. We announced a new green shipping corridor between Los Angeles and Shanghai. And so, go to the website for the Our Ocean Conference and you'll see all sorts of very interesting commitments that came about. Now, the third thing is, so what are we doing this year? Well, we really like this model of the Our Ocean Conference, and we're trying to kind of keep it going towards COP27, focusing in particular this time on shipping decarbonization. We announced with Norway a couple of weeks ago what we're calling the Green Shipping Challenge. And that Green Shipping Challenge is going to be kind of an umbrella for all manner of things that relate to reducing the carbon footprint of shipping, whether it's in port, whether it relates to low carbon or no carbon fuels, whether it relates to the designation of more specific green shipping corridors, et cetera. Those are all going to be kind of covered by this Green Shipping Challenge. So we're working on getting countries to sign up as well as others. So, any ideas you want to throw into the hopper, or whether you want to sign up through your organization, we would very much welcome that. So thanks very much.
Sue, really appreciate that. Perfect way to wrap this conversation up. Thank you so much for those remarks. Before we call this a day, we want to hear from you. So this is the important part. I'm going to pass it over to my incredible colleague at IOM, Roberta Romano, who's going to lead this brief discussion. So Roberta, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. So since we have few minutes and I will not take much of your time, I just want to thank the panelists. Their experiences are incredibly inspiring and really motivating. We wanted this event to have a twofold kind of objective. So on one end, to hear really from the experiences, the best practices of incredible activists like yourselves, but also to understand more generally how diaspora actors can be better involved and engaged within the multilateral global conversations that are taking place on this issue. And we have now, obviously, we're all very much in agreement of the importance of a multi-stakeholder consultative approach that has been mentioned several times already during the presentation. So we have two questions. If you can just click on your answers, just to have a sense of how actors like yourselves that represent diaspora leaders, diaspora organizations have been involved in the past in global fora. So have you been to a COP event before? Yes or no? And then on a scale of 1 to 5, how interested are you in participating in COP27? 1 being not interested at all and 5 being extremely interested. Please vote, and then we will see the results of the poll. Okay, so I think as my colleague is able to share the poll results, since we have very few minutes left, I wanted to bring, okay, I hear see. So we see that nobody has been involved so far in a COP event. And this is very interesting, since we really hope that this series of consultations will also kind of gather, different voices in order to be able then for those voices to be represented in such fora. And then we see like a very high interest. Most people, 64% of the participants answered 5 as being extremely interested, and then we have a 4 and a 3. So obviously there is an interest in this sense. And the final question we want to ask to all of you, including participants in the audience, but also our speakers, is what do you think that in your view, how can we as governments and international humanitarian actors ensure that diasporas are engaged, they are included, they are brought to the table as long-term problem solvers and innovators, rather than just as a source of different types of contributions? They might be financial or or human. And also, would COP27 be a good platform to begin including diasporas in these discussions? So if you would like to write your answers in the chat, or also take the floor briefly, just, considering we have very few minutes. So one is like, what can we do as government and international humanitarian and development actors to better include diaspora voices? And then, do you think COP27 would be a good platform in this sense? We see yes, a must. Thank you, Mandy, for your contribution. I love the decisiveness. And if anybody else wants to write in the chat or just share, taking the floor briefly, we would love to hear from you. So we have the questions that has been also, yes, we see it definitely. But also the first side of the question is like, how can we, as governments and humanitarian actors and development actors, how can we ensure a more effective engagement of diasporas as innovators? And if anybody wants to take the floor, even among the speakers or anybody from the audience, please let us know what you think.
Angelo, I like your response in the chat about travel just not only being cost prohibitive, but the distance to go and to get to these places. So while COVID was a nightmare for so many, the connectedness that we have virtually and these conversations that we have online, is there a virtual component to COP that either before, during, or after that would be of interest to groups and individuals and different folks that we can leverage so that people don't take 6 flights and spend 3 days on either side getting to a meeting, an important meeting, but a meeting.
I think so, particularly with our elected officials and our leaders. If you were to host a webinar, 300 people from home are not going to pop up.
Yeah.
But within like our local government, we have elected representatives who work on these issues, and then we have agency staff who work on these issues. And it can be very difficult for them to get information. So they're very targeted. And then the role of a diaspora is, like, for example, Capitol Hill Ocean Week was this week. Hundreds of people from across the country came to Washington, D.C. to talk about ocean issues. And I was literally the only person from the Mariana Islands, right? And so, I can't represent everybody, but I can phone back home and tell them what we talked about, and it sort of be like that bridge and that go-between, and that I'm just one person, but it's a starting place.
And thank you, Angelo. I think what you mentioned about the bridging role of diaspora members is so important, and that's why conversations like these have really an impact that goes beyond the people around this virtual table, because definitely what you represent is you represent the bigger constituencies of communities affected at home, and then you can report back and also represent their views. So that's very helpful. So here we have another comment from Mike. I have had so many relatives and friends go to COP, but it circles back to the questions I posed. We go and we spend money, time, travel to be heard while our village back home is under the ocean. So that this comment, Mike, thank you, brings, an important question around what's the value and the impact of those global international event, and how can we really ensure then that there are concrete implications and positive outcomes for the affected community. We have a question here for Angelo. Is there a way to better support diaspora working in this space to get information back to their communities that they have connections?
There's no simple answer to that. So I work in conservation, and their conservation is an elite, mostly liberal space, and it has been white dominated. Like if you read books from the 1970s, like there weren't even women involved in conservation back in the 70s, other than like Sylvia Earle. It was mostly white men. So, the starting places aren't that many diaspora. And so within these large institutions, whether it's academia, government, or nonprofit, the first step is just diversity. Like they have to do hiring. They have to get some of these people in the door. Once they're in the door, they have to help keep that door open so that people can follow as you move up that ladder. But diversity is really just the first step. You also have to help folks stay in those positions. It can be a very scary place. When you are the first hyphenated American to do something, that's a hard thing to do. And there are lots of hyphenated Americans doing first things for the first time ever. It's a great time to be alive. Since the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago, I think as a society, the United States is giving this issue greater attention. So in my personal capacity, I helped create a people of color employee resource group at my last employer, just so that they felt safe coming to work, and so that they could meet people who looked like them, who had similar life experiences, and they could just talk about work. So again, no easy answer, but the starting place is sort of like with hiring, and then keeping them there, and then helping them move up the ladder, whatever institution that they're in, across our entire society. So no small task.
Thank you, Angelo. I think I just wanted to maybe conclude. We have one more, we have a comment from Mandy talking about soliciting the views of diasporas and then distilling their messages in a way that can be also translated and transferred into some decision-making circles. So I think, we have laid out here some important steps. One is increasing diversity and ensuring that really there is a very wide representation, especially of the affected communities, and diaspora can definitely support the representation, and then collecting views, distilling them, and trying to ensure that they are then represented within those circles. And also I see another comment about working with local partners in country to create platforms and spaces the diaspora can relate with, that include high-level decision makers where those influencers seems accessible and can actually move the needles. Those are all very relevant comments. We will, I think, as organizer, we will review your comments also at the end of this event, and ensuring that this conversation becomes actionable, and that we can play our role as government representatives and humanitarian development organizations to really make this multi-stakeholder approach and a more inclusive approach really a reality, and not just a desire. So I think, since we have been already keeping you a bit beyond the scheduled time, unless there are other comments, I see colleagues have to move on to other commitments. Just wanted to, again, take the opportunity to thank you. There is so much content, so much commitment and passion, and really a lot of inspiration coming from your experiences, your stories. Thank you so much for the work you do on a daily basis, and for joining us today and share your vision for a better place, for a better world. And so thanks to our colleagues at State Department for co-organizing this with us. We will have other events coming, 2 more before COP27. And thank you, Angelo. The applause goes to you, actually, and all of you for all your work. So we have one more question just before you leave, so that you can help us shape the agendas for the next event. What topics would you like to see in future Diaspora Voices Combating the Climate Crisis events? You have a number of options here on sustainable agriculture, shipping and supply chain, food security, desertification, dealing with exacerbated natural disaster, climate and indigenous population, climate and gender, or other topic. So please, if you can vote before we conclude, and then thank you again. And I think this is the end of our event, and we are really grateful.